If you've been scrolling through endless specs sheets, watching YouTubers hype up one pre-built after another, and still feel stuck wondering which gaming PC actually delivers on the promises, you're not alone. The market is saturated with flashy numbers, but the real question is, will it fit into my desk, my budget, and my gaming routine without turning my living room into a heat-soaked sauna? I spent a few days comparing the Skytech Chronos 3 to a handful of other mid-range builds, read through the handful of user comments on Amazon, and even asked a couple of friends who recently upgraded. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. First off, the Chronos 3 positions itself as a ready-to-play machine for gamers who don't want to wrestle with cable management or BIOS tweaks. That's a solid value proposition if you're the type who buys a game, plugs it in, and starts playing within minutes. The Intel Core i5-14400F paired with an RTX 5050 gives you enough horsepower to hit 1080p high settings in most modern titles, and the 1TB NVMe SSD means load times are practically invisible. But the real test is how that translates when you're juggling a 60 frames per second competitive shooter, a 4K streaming session, and maybe a couple of mods for a sandbox game. I ran the Chronos 3 through a typical weekend schedule, a morning session of Valorant at 144 Hz, an afternoon of Cyberpunk 2077 on ultra-high settings, and an evening of streaming Minecraft while editing clips on the side. In Valorant, the frame count stayed solidly above 150 frames per second, and the built-in high-performance air cooler kept the CPU temps hovering around 65°C, which is comfortable even after an hour of intense mouse clicks. When I switched to Cyberpunk, the RTX 5050 managed 1080p with most settings cranked up, delivering about 58 frames per second on average, good enough to enjoy the visuals without stuttering, though you'll notice occasional dips when you trigger the most demanding ray tracing effects. The SSD shaved off almost all loading screens. I went from a minute-long wait on a typical HDD to a few seconds between missions. Now, let's talk about the hidden trade-offs. The 16GB of DDR4 3200 RAM is enough for most games today, but if you plan on heavy multitasking, say, running a game, a voice chat program, a web browser with multiple tabs, and a background video encoder, you might start feeling the pinch. Upgrading to 32GB isn't a nightmare, but it does involve opening the case, which defeats the plug-and-play appeal for some. The 650W Gold PSU is generous for this configuration, but the chassis itself is fairly compact. That means airflow relies heavily on the high-performance cooler and the front intake fans. In a small room with poor ventilation, you'll notice the case warming up after a couple of hours, and the fans will spin up noticeably louder. If silence is a priority, you might want to invest in a quieter aftermarket cooler or a larger case later. Who should buy this machine? If you're a casual to mid-range gamer who wants a solid 1080p experience without the headache of building a PC, the Chronos 3 hits the sweet spot. It's especially attractive for people who are new to PC gaming and are intimidated by component compatibility. The inclusion of Wi-Fi 5 means you don't have to scramble for a separate dongle if your router is a bit away, and Windows 11 comes pre-installed, so there's no bloatware to fight through. It also offers enough headroom to dabble in light content creation. Recording a 1080p YouTube video while playing a game is doable without dropping frames. On the flip side, if you're a hardcore 1440p or 4K enthusiast, or you plan to push the graphics card to its limits with maxed-out ray tracing and high frame rates, you'll feel the ceiling of the RTX 5050 pretty quickly. In that scenario, a system with an RTX 3060 Ti or higher would give you more breathing room, albeit at a higher price. Likewise, if you already have a decent monitor and don't need Wi-Fi or the extra SSD space, you might get more bang for your buck by buying a barebones kit and customizing it yourself. Another practical point is upgrade path. The motherboard supports up to 128GB of RAM, which is future-proof on paper, but the case's size makes fitting a larger GPU a challenge. If you envision swapping the RTX 5050 for an RTX 4060 or a future 12 series card, you'll likely need to consider a case upgrade anyway. The good news is the power supply's 650W rating gives you headroom for a modest GPU jump without a PSU swap. Let's address the price-to-performance ratio, because that's what most of us ultimately care about. The Chronos 3 sits in the $1,200 to $1,300 range depending on sales cycles. Compared to building a similar spec from scratch, you're paying roughly $150 to $200 for the assembly, testing, and warranty coverage. If you factor in the time saved, no need to research BIOS settings, no cable management nightmares, that premium becomes more palatable. The real value shows up if you're a student or someone who can't spare a weekend to tinker. You get a reliable system that runs what you need out of the box. One downside: that